Chapter 25 discusses the period of the 60s, which has a ton of information. So this will likely be one of your longer lectures of the year, so bear with me. So at the onset of the 60s came the election of President John F. Kennedy. Now, his domestic agenda was known as the New Frontier. And some of his goals were a lot of federal spending on urban renewal projects. So that would come in the form of a lot of infrastructure projects in major cities. An increase in the minimum wage, federal funds for the impoverished, federal funds for public education, Medicare, which would be public health insurance for the elderly, increased civil rights legislation. Kennedy is unfortunately assassinated, so a lot of these goals had to be taken up by his vice president, who took office as president after his death, Lyndon Johnson. So some of these things are achieved under Kennedy, others have to be taken up by President Johnson in order to be achieved. President Kennedy is also pretty well known for founding the Peace Corps, and his goal is for U.S. citizens to volunteer and do a public service, but overseas. And he thought that this would really help in showing goodwill efforts from the United States. And it is a successful program that exists even today because of how successful it was. The space race between the United States and Soviet Union, we already mentioned when we talked about the launching of Sputnik in 1957, but the Soviets were also the first to put a man in space. Yuri Gagarin entered the atmosphere, or exited the atmosphere, I should say, in 1961. Now, the U.S. lifted Alan Shepard into space within a month, but President Kennedy was really upset that NASA was always falling short of the Soviets by a little bit. So Kennedy actually announces in his inaugural address that he intended for NASA to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And although Kennedy didn't live to see it, the U.S. did indeed land Apollo 11 on the moon in 1969, and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong become the first men to walk on the surface of the moon. The Berlin Wall is constructed in 1961, and it is meant to prevent any East Berliners from escaping into West Berlin and therefore getting away from the Communist Soviet Union. So this was meant to consolidate the power of the Soviet Union in East Berlin. Now, the Berlin Wall you can see here under construction, and then you can see in 1989 the celebrations of the Berlin Wall coming down, which we will come back to in future lectures. The Bay of Pigs invasion was directly linked to fear of the communist government in Cuba, which Cuba was only 90 miles off of the coast of the state of Florida. So Fidel Castro and Che Guevara took power in Cuba in 1959. Kennedy supported a rebel Cuban group by training them for an invasion. And when this invasion actually took place in April of 1961, he kind of gets nervous about the situation and does not provide U.S. planes for air support for those invasion troops. So there's a bunch of Cuban refugees that are trying to invade. They are expecting help from the United States. The United States does not provide that help, and the Cuban invasion is an absolute failure. So this is a pretty big embarrassment for President Kennedy, and it emboldens the communist Cubans and the Soviet Union. This almost directly results in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So with this emboldened behavior, the Soviet Union begins sending offensive nuclear missiles into Cuba. Naturally, this scares the United States. The United States finds photographic evidence via some U-2 spy plane missions over Cuba, and the U.S. demands a removal, of course, of the missiles, initiates a quarantine of Cuba. They very carefully use the term quarantine because a blockade is in fact an act of war, and eventually a secret deal is struck where the Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba, but the U.S. would have to agree to never invade Cuba, as well as remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey and Europe. So, a trade of sorts. An advancement in civil rights early in the 1960s was that legislative voting districts have to be the same population size. Now, why is this? Well, prior to this Supreme Court decision, southern states would often lump lots of black neighborhoods into a congressional district that was exponentially larger in population than more white congressional districts. This is giving those white neighborhoods more bang for their buck, I guess you could say, in that they did not need to have near as much a population in order to have a representative in Congress. Well, this 1962 Supreme Court decision, Baker versus Carr, is clarifying that that is unconstitutional. All congressional districts must be of comparable population size. By 1963, the March on Washington takes place. It's important to consider the year, 1963, and a lot of the things that we've talked about in previous chapters, such as the Greensboro 4 photograph from the last chapter that was compared to a later sit-in that included white participants. Well, white participants also joined what came to really be known as the Million Man March in Washington. And you can see here Martin Luther King speaking in front of, very intentionally speaking in front of, Abraham Lincoln's memorial and out onto the reflecting pool facing the Washington Monument. If you remember back to the Great Depression and Marian Anderson, the black opera singer who had a show canceled in Washington when they found out that she was a black woman, and so First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt went to great lengths to arrange an outdoor concert at the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King chooses this symbolism as well. So this is an important event, but it's even more important to show that not only has the movement grown in sheer numbers, as can be seen by the crowds surrounding the reflection pool, but also that this crowd was very diverse. It included whites who were now stepping up to support the civil rights movement. Probably one of the most famous events in all of American history is a sad and unfortunate event in which President Kennedy is assassinated. He's assassinated by a man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, who is then shot and killed within a couple of days of the assassination. Now, this is controversial. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. Now, one question that cannot really be answered is, was Lee Harvey Oswald working for someone? Did he carry out this assassination just because he was what would be referred to as a lone wolf, a crazy person? Or was he working on behalf of the Soviet Union or another communist government? Was he working on behalf of the mafia? Was he working on behalf of our own CIA? It's hard to answer that question. Other conspiracy theories that have existed over the years can actually be pretty easily debunked. One of the things, and you can see an older sketch from the Warren Commission that investigated and reached a conclusion about the assassination and who was involved. This is referred to, this sketch, as the magic bullet theory. However, the magic bullet is a silly theory because if you were to take into account the position of both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally, you would see this kind of comparison made. Governor Connally was sitting in the limousine with President Kennedy in what's known as a jump seat, which is a portable seat that can be taken into and out of a limousine. And this jump seat made him sit lower as well as more inset into the vehicle than the magic bullet theory imagined. Let me go back. The magic bullet theory shows them sitting on the same level and shows them sitting directly in front of and in back of each other. Whereas the reality of the limousine was Governor Connally sitting lower and more inset. So this old magic bullet theory is false. This, the single bullet, can be very easily recreated when you take into account the actual seating of Governor Connally. This is all extremely well laid out in a PBS Nova series episode called Cold Case JFK. If you're interested in these conspiracy theories and want to see at least one of them debunked, watch Cold Case JFK. So you can see here Vice President Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office to become president. Next to him is his wife, Lady Bird, and President Kennedy's wife, Jackie. Now, Lyndon Johnson is quite the opposite of President Kennedy. Kennedy was raised in a wealthy New England family, and Johnson grew up in central Texas in a very impoverished region of the state and the country. He held a very New Deal view of the federal government, that the federal government had this obligation to assist less fortunate members of society. So he takes some of President Kennedy's agenda items, like helping the impoverished, much more seriously. He, in fact, declares war on poverty. He creates another organization similar to the Peace Corps, then known as VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. Today, it has been rebranded the AmeriCorps. He passes Medicare and Medicaid medical insurance programs into law through Congress and signed by himself. This is to provide medical care for the elderly and for the poor, respectively. He also passes additional education funding, a Kennedy priority that he achieved after the death of President Kennedy. And you can see a photograph to the right taken directly from the Foner textbook that shows President Johnson visiting Appalachia, which is very much the same region that the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, was meant to aid. It is one of the most impoverished places in all of the United States. By 1964, President Johnson needs to run for re-election, and his re-election campaign is happening in the midst of an extremely revolutionary year. It is in 1964 that the 24th Amendment outlaws the use of poll taxes in federal elections. This disadvantaged poor blacks and had long been used in the Jim Crow South to systematically exclude blacks from voting. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws discrimination in public facilities, but also private businesses. This is a big step. This means that not only would Brown versus Board of Education from 10 years prior in 1954 keep public facilities integrated, it would also force private businesses to integrate. It is the summer of 1964, after efforts like the 24th Amendment and Civil Rights Act, that the Freedom Summer movement takes place, which is an attempt to get as many black voters as possible registered in the state of Mississippi. It is during that Freedom Summer that three men, two of them college students visiting the South via the SNCC organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you should recognize that from last chapter, Andrew Goodman and Michael Henry Schwerner. They were assisted by a local man named James Earl Chaney. Now, as the story goes, these men are trying to get many people registered to vote, and they're pulled over by the police, as they're used to, being harassed because of their efforts to advance civil rights. And they're taken for questioning, again, very routine, they're being harassed. But when they are released from police custody, they drive down the road and are almost immediately abducted. So someone, very clearly, in the Philadelphia, Mississippi Police Department had given away their location and time of release to local Klansmen, who then abducted these men. When the FBI got involved by the order of President Johnson, and they begin searching for these men's bodies, they are uncovering dozens of other bodies. And it's very disturbing to show just how common lynching is in the Jim Crow South. So these three men having gone missing was not only tragic, but uncovering other tragedies as well. In November, President Johnson trounces Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater in the presidential election. Johnson sees this as a mandate, which just means a free hand politically, to further his major agenda items, like his war on poverty, more with civil rights, and lastly, something he had tried prior to the elections to keep very quiet, to fight and hopefully win the Vietnam War. So, President Johnson received 61% of the popular vote and 90% of the electoral vote. An absolute trouncing of Senator Goldwater. The Heart of Atlanta Motel, again, gave Congress the power to force Civil Rights Act legislation that integrated private businesses. It gave Congress the power to force these changes, and by force of federal government officials if necessary. So this is a major development. The Heart of Atlanta Motel was piggybacking, shall we say, off of Brown versus Board of Education from 10 years prior. You also have additional laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawing things like literacy tests and other discriminatory practices, as well as the Fair Housing Act, which outlawed discriminating against blacks in the real estate business. The very famous American play, A Raisin in the Sun, starring Sidney Poitier in the film version as well, are depicting the type of discrimination that blacks often faced when trying to buy and own and maintain a home. You also had militant civil rights movements. So a man by the name of Malcolm X encouraged blacks to fight back rather than to continue with civil disobedience in the way of Martin Luther King. There was also the Black Panther Party. This is a militant organization that also advocated for violent pushback for the kinds of oppressive treatment that blacks were suffering. They wore a uniform of all black clothing, particularly leather jackets, belts, and berets. They were often armed, and they often escorted blacks into places that would be too dangerous to go on their own. Later in the 60s and into the 70s, the concept of affirmative action came to be. So admissions to college or to job hiring, this was giving preference to women and or minorities to try to level the playing field when it came to admissions into universities and or hiring practices. So in a famous Supreme Court decision after this period, the Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation v. Weber, a white man sued his employer for denying him a promotion based on his race. Now, the Supreme Court ruled in this case, though, that the affirmative action was acceptable because the company was trying to pursue racial balance. And you can see two views here in political cartoons of affirmative action. One, that white males need not apply because they're not being hired, while the door for women and minorities is wide open. Another view, however, is a man already at the top of a mountain saying, "Hey, no cheating," to a person of color who is simply stepping on top of a box to get started up that mountain. So two very different views of affirmative action. These types of debates and controversies still exist today. Now, probably the single most famous legal matters to come out of the 1960s were the rights of the accused being supported by the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren. 3 court cases that dealt with the rights of the accused in the early 1960s are listed here. Allow me to explain them one by one. In 1961, a woman by the name of Eileen Mapp was believed to be harboring a fugitive in her home, and the police entered, and they entered without a warrant looking for this criminal. And while they were in her home, and this criminal was not present, they noticed that she had a pornography collection. And in 1961, in the state of Ohio, pornography was illegal. She was prosecuted. She and her attorneys appealed all the way to and including the Supreme Court, saying that she could not be prosecuted because the police had wrongfully entered her home and therefore illegally acquired evidence against her. The court agreed with Eileen Mapp and her attorneys that illegally acquired evidence cannot be used against someone in court. So police have to be very careful when collecting evidence, and lawyers have to be very careful in what they are choosing to put forward in court, because if for some reason it would be deemed inadmissible, it could result in someone who actually is guilty of a crime going free. So you have to be very careful about how you handle evidence, both as a police officer and as a lawyer. Another case concerning a man named Clarence Earl Gideon, a man from Florida who was arrested and accused of stealing a lot of change out of a cigarette machine at a bar that he had supposedly broken into after hours. Now, there wasn't a ton of evidence, but Clarence Earl Gideon could not afford an attorney to represent him, so he had to do it himself. And he didn't obviously do a very good job as not a trained lawyer, and he ended up going to jail. Well, while in jail, he wrote to the Supreme Court numerous times. They finally heard his case, and they did decide that any crime, not just capital crimes like murder, for example, still required that the state provide a lawyer to those unable to pay for one. And in this case, that would have been the state of Florida. So just because Clarence Earl Gideon was accused of a lesser crime, not a serious capital crime, doesn't mean he's not entitled to an attorney. So regardless of ability to pay, you must be provided an attorney. In 1964, in Escobedo versus Illinois, in this case, the accused, Danny Escobedo, was denied his right to counsel while he was being questioned by the police. So he specifically requested an attorney to be present during his questioning. They denied that request, and the information that they got from him was used against him to convict him of the crime. So Danny Escobedo actually went free because the accused have a right to request an attorney. You can see that the primary thing that is being dealt with here with rights of the accused is your 4th through 8th Amendments rights. These are like in a courtroom what your legal rights are. So Eileen Mapp addresses Amendment 4. She had evidence that was illegally seized. Basic overall rights of Eileen Mapp, Clarence Earl Gideon, and Danny Escobedo are addressed in Amendment 5, as well as Amendment 6. Now, things that were not specifically addressed in those 3 cases are things like jury trials in civil cases. So a very, very, very large lawsuit, for example, larger than a certain amount of money. And lastly, cruel and unusual punishment. So excessive amounts of bail being demanded by a judge, excessive punishments. You can't send someone to jail for decades for like a petty theft. So these are all of your rights of the accused that are being addressed here. Now, all of this kind of came together in 1966. A man by the name of Ernesto Miranda kidnapped and repeatedly raped a woman. The police got him to sign a written confession, but he had never been informed of his right to an attorney. He didn't request one, but he also wasn't aware that he was entitled to one if he wanted one. So he never asks. He goes ahead and signs the confession, and he had lawyers appeal this all the way to the Supreme Court, and he was set free based on the fact that he had not been informed of his right to an attorney. He did not, according to this decision, need to request an attorney. He had to be informed by the authorities of his right to an attorney. So this is where the term Miranda rights comes from. It's unfortunate that someone accused of a much lesser crime, Clarence Earl Gideon, for example, if we called them Gideon rights, because Ernesto Miranda was guilty of kidnapping and rape and was let free because of this situation, but nonetheless he was guilty of a crime, and the Miranda rights, anyway, that we name after him today, you must be informed of the crime that you're being arrested for, that you have a right to remain silent, that you don't have to answer questions until you have an attorney present, that you have the right to that attorney, and lastly, that if you cannot afford an attorney, that one would be provided to you. So I'm sure you've heard Miranda rights being used if you've watched any kind of a television show or movie in which someone is being arrested. You are under arrest for murder. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If one cannot be paid for, one will be provided to you by the court. And lastly, and most importantly, officers have to ask, do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? And if the person does not answer in the affirmative that they understand, you cannot begin to question them. Because what if they don't speak the same language? That's one of the biggest reasons why. Once they answer in the affirmative and say, yes, I understand, you can begin questioning them. But if after being informed of those rights, identifying that they understand them, you begin questioning and they say, I'm not saying anything until I have my attorney present, you immediately have to cease questioning until they have an attorney present. So there are very, very, very stringent rules on how the accused are treated by the authorities as well as by the court system. So advancements for women are inspired by success in the civil rights and legal rights revolution of the 50s and 60s. So now the National Organization for Women was formed in 1966. Some of their primary goals were equal pay for equal work. If a woman and a man are doing the same job, they should be paid the same amount of money. And then daycare centers for working mothers was a big goal as well. This second goal is still an issue that is being discussed politically today. Title IX in 1972 established that no one can be denied the right to participate in a school program funded by the federal government based on their gender. So this is where a lot of schools that did not have female sports, for example, they only had male sports. Well, if they were going to have male sports, they also had to have female sports. It would be considered discriminatory to only have sports for men. And you may not realize it, but it is true that up through and including 1972, that there were many schools where sports were only for males. You also have in 1972 a push for the Equal Rights Amendment. It promoted specific language guaranteeing women some of the rights listed above. It did not, however, gain enough state legislatures' approvals to become a constitutional amendment. So it made it through the two-thirds majority vote of both houses of Congress, and then it simply could not achieve the 3/4 of all the state legislatures. So it fell short. Now, two cases to a woman's right to privacy, about 8 years apart from each other. The first was a case in which the state of Connecticut was denying people's private use of contraceptives, so birth control. And the Supreme Court said that was an invasion of privacy, and you could not do that. Well, a follow-up to that 8 years later got even more specific about a woman's right to privacy when a Texas law that outlawed abortion was overruled because it was considered to be a violation of a woman's right to privacy. So Roe v. Wade decided that women could have an abortion within the first 6 months of a pregnancy. But in the final 3 months, the fetus was considered to have by that point become a person and could not be aborted. This threshold has changed a little bit over the years with the advancements in medicine, and the reason they used in 1973 after 6 months, it really wasn't until after 6 months that a baby could actually survive outside of its mother. I've personally known family and friends who had premature birth children younger than 6 months that luckily, because of advancements in technology, they were able to be saved, and they're perfectly healthy children today. So this 6 months of pregnancy, final 3 months of pregnancy, this has shifted a little bit, but nonetheless the concept of Roe v. Wade still stands, that it is a woman's right to privacy with her significant other and her doctor to have an abortion. And this is obviously very controversial because there's a lot of opponents that say a fetus is a person much sooner than these original time frames, and even some of the time frames that have been adjusted for today are also controversial. So, two things, this political cartoon showing rams butting heads, they're interlocked, their horns, very, very good depiction of how controversial this is, and two people at a protest in Washington, D.C., one supporting and one opposing abortion. So very, very controversial issue. And the central question, when is a fetus considered a baby? And really, you compare it to 1973 and Roe v. Wade. The cutoff for when you could receive an abortion was more here. It has since shifted backward a little bit, but like I said, because of advancements in medicine. However, there are people who think that way, way further down the line is when a fetus is considered a person. So, yeah, this is not an issue that's going to be ever concretely solved because there's two completely different schools of thought in how to view this issue. Shifting now in the direction back to foreign policy, we discussed some foreign policy with Kennedy's creation of the Peace Corps, the handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion before that. Now, to bring it back around again, the Vietnam War had been developing ever since the French lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So the French have withdrawn from Vietnam. They are now asking for the United States to step in to try to avoid a communist takeover from the communist North Vietnamese government over the South Vietnamese, which was still democratic. So, Eisenhower, in the 50s, is sending military aid, a lot of money and a lot of weapons, to aid South Vietnam. President Kennedy, in the early 60s, is sending advisors, so really military officers who could help train the South Vietnamese, help them strategize, and that begins in 1961. By 1964, it was very clear that the South Vietnamese might fall to the Viet Cong have the United States not stepped in. And so the United States did step in, and the involvement in Vietnam by the United States begins. Now you can see this political cartoon that the United States was gradually climbing this escalation staircase and ignoring some of the warning signs that this was a staircase to nowhere. This man's about to fall off when he gets to the top. And a very, very thoughtful, deep-thinking political cartoon to analyze. Here is a photograph of President Lyndon Johnson, who took over as president after the assassination of President Kennedy. He single-handedly escalated the war in Vietnam to what we think of it today as. So Here is President Johnson with his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and oddly enough, in the background is a sculpture of President Kennedy looking over them. And President Kennedy had indicated right around the time that he was assassinated that he wasn't comfortable continuing to aid Vietnam so extensively. Lyndon Johnson obviously changed course after taking over. So in 1964, one of the biggest reasons that President Johnson was given the kind of authority to advance the war in Vietnam the way he did was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So President Johnson is informed that the North Vietnamese had attacked U.S. ships with gunboats in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. Congress very swiftly signs the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use military force in Vietnam completely at his discretion. Now, Johnson did wait until after his re-election in 1964 before escalating the war in 1965 significantly. Later, it's discovered that some of the information that was being used to say U.S. ships had been attacked off the coast of Vietnam was actually partly false. So, upon reflection, there's really not even much of a reason to have passed this resolution, which is unfortunate because of how quickly out of control the Vietnam War became. In 1965, you finally have U.S. troops landing in Vietnam for the purposes of combat, not just being advisors. So in March of 1965, U.S. Marines land at Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam, and it was the way it was sold to the public, the way it was explained in the media, was that they were there for base security, but nonetheless they were doing some fighting. The first huge battle of Vietnam was in November of 1965 when the U.S. Army Air Cavalry lands in the Ai Drang Valley. And the NVA nearly overruns the U.S. soldiers. And victory at Ai Drang is only due to the superior weapons and technology that the U.S. had, such as helicopters. And the man in charge in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, claims an overwhelming victory and exudes nothing but confidence in the United States' ability to win. So President Johnson, on Westmoreland and Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara's advice, exponentially increases U.S. commitment in Vietnam as a result. A good depiction of the Ai Drang is a Hollywood film called We Were Soldiers. So you can see here some soldiers taking the field from a helicopter. This was the modern cavalry. So you can see the symbol of their unit here still had a horse in the corner of the symbol, but in the 20th century, in technological advancements, now instead of horses or tanks, although tanks were still used, you had helicopters. And so this is known as the air cavalry. Now, Colonel Hal Moore in the film is played by Mel Gibson, but this is an actual photo from the Ai Drang Valley of Colonel Hal Moore. So there's actually a deleted scene that if you view it off of the DVD, deleted scenes, I wish they had kept it in the film, because Colonel Moore has a meeting with General William Westmoreland right after the battle, and Westmoreland is exuding confidence, and Hal Moore is warning him, I don't think this is going to be what you think it's going to be. They were an extremely, extremely motivated enemy, very hard to defeat. You are not realizing the gravity of the situation. But nonetheless, we continued to escalate the war. Now, widely believed by most historians to be the turning point is the Tet Offensive in 1968. For a long time, the United States, back at home, the common citizen is being told, we are winning. It's just going to take some more time and effort, but we are winning. So in 1965, there were 184,000 troops by the end of the year. By 1968, there are over 500,000 men in Vietnam. This is all justified by saying, we're winning, we're almost there, stick with us. So all that confidence made people very startled when the Viet Cong executed the Tet Offensive. Normally there had been a ceasefire during the holiday of Tet, which is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam. But during Tet in 1968, the communists actually took advantage and attacked countless places all over South Vietnam. You can see all of the major battles. Some really heavy fighting in Hue is a very famous piece to this puzzle. Pleiku. There are some stories that would shock you. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was under attack. And so this very much soured the American people's view of the war in Vietnam. They didn't feel like leadership had been honest with them and that we were in fact winning. It didn't help that Vietnam was the first televised war. And so images like this, a South Vietnamese officer executing a Viet Cong guerrilla fighter who at this moment is actually handcuffed. He is subdued. He is no danger to anyone anymore, yet he was executed right in the streets of Saigon. This is one of the many very famous images from the war in Vietnam. As a result of both Tet souring people's opinions and images like this, the anti-war movement grows exponentially. There was already an anti-war movement, but it was seen as kind of a fringe group that could no longer be ignored after the Tet Offensive, because anti-war protesters are now more convincing, they're gaining more support, and they're gaining more members who will go on marches, for example, with them. Here is another famous image where a protest outside of the Pentagon resulted in flowers being put down the barrels of the military police's weapons, meaning what we want is actually peace. We don't want violence. We want the violence overseas in Vietnam to end, as a matter of fact. More images, such as this man with a look of despair on his face, having a cigarette before he goes about his duties. This young looking man with "War is Hell" on his helmet. And then, of course, this photograph can be analyzed in so many ways. Not only the severity of injuries, as you can see these men are pretty badly injured, but 3 out of the 4 men, plus 1 in the background in this photo, are black men. And black men could not escape the draft as well as others, because statistically speaking, especially in the 1960s, minorities lived in a state of poverty at much higher rates than whites. And one of the ways you could get out of being sent to Vietnam was to receive a college deferment. So you could go to college and just stay in college for the duration of the war. There were people who went all the way through and got PhDs with no real intent of ever needing to take advantage of those PhDs. Some did, certainly did. Others got those PhDs not because they actually wanted to pursue a career, but because they wanted to avoid going overseas. And so blacks are much more affected, statistically speaking, as a result of that, by the Vietnam War. A great book, it's called Bloods, is the African American history of the war in Vietnam, and some very, very vivid recollections and stories. More images that startled people. Look at the horror on that face. Blindfolded, tied to a rail, terrified. There might be a story behind this. But the American people don't care. They see these images and they're horrified. This young girl, who had had her clothing burned off and a napalm strike on her village, running down the street away from the village, screaming and crying. And this is even more disturbing when you see soldiers seeming to just go about their business, that this is a normal sight. Screaming and crying, children running down the street. So this was another very disturbing image. The shooting at Kent State University. You can see one person laying on the ground having been shot after a protest got out of control and the National Guard, instead of getting it to be put down peacefully, fired into the crowd. As I mentioned, this was on every television screen. This was on every newspaper. And you can see both a disturbing image on the television, plus the man here holding his newspaper. This was in the living room of every single American home. As a result, you had the counterculture, people that would be called hippies today. And they not only didn't support the war in Vietnam, but much like the Beats in the 1950s, were not even supportive of traditional American lifestyle. And probably one of the most epic displays of the hippie movement is the Woodstock Music Festival in White Lake, New York. So towards the end of the 60s, President Johnson is extremely unpopular at this point. He announces in March of 1968 that he would not seek re-election. Now, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, ran in his place on the Democratic ticket. Another Democrat, Governor George Wallace of Alabama, ran a third-party campaign. And his third-party campaign was that he would roll back civil rights. He would do away with some of the civil rights legislation that had been passed. In a very, very divided election, Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who, yes, was the same person who had lost to President Kennedy in 1960, was elected in an electoral landslide despite only actually getting about 43% of the popular vote. Once in office, Nixon is promising peace with honor in Vietnam. He used this phrase repeatedly throughout his campaign, and we will assess how realistic that was or was not in our coming discussions and lectures. That is the end of the Chapter 25 lecture. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in class.